Hi guys, it's Maynard. We're going to try this again, our Tuesday afternoon videos, just talking about what's going on in the energy world. We've got some of the same crew coming back. Mike Bradley is back with us, Matt Portillo, Colin Fenton. But we've added a few new guests today to keep the stew healthy and interesting. George O'Leary is a Senior Managing Director in our Oilfield Service Research area. Doug McGovern is a Senior Energy Restructuring Banker. And Ann Bradbury is the President of the AXPC and has had quite a lot of dealings in Washington, D.C. of late. So we're particularly excited to have Ann. And that's actually where we'll start. Ann, thank you for joining. I think if you wouldn't mind, most people know the AXPC, but just for clarity, if you would talk about your group, talk about your effort, and then touch on what you've been doing over the last 3 weeks, because I know you've been seeing our friends in Washington quite a lot.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me on. Happy to do that. So AXPC is the American Exploration and Production Council. We represent 25 of the biggest independent onshore domestic producers. We like to say that we are the authors of the American energy renaissance, which has literally changed the American energy landscape. At this moment in time, the shale industry is really ground zero for the current supply crisis and is also significantly impacted by the demand shock that we're seeing. And from a Washington perspective, our primary responsibility is to advocate for our industry and our companies in Washington. It's an interesting conversation because it's certainly a lot about jobs and all about the impacts this is having on our companies. But we're also able to talk quite a bit about the geopolitical impact that our companies and our industry has had for this country. So when we're talking to state, when we're talking to the White House, and we're talking to Congress, the fact that, America is energy independent largely because of our companies and our industry, is a really important fact, that makes us, impactful, and as an additional concern to policymakers.
So I think, Ann, the question we all have on the outside looking in with respect to Washington is, do they really get it? I think a lot of us understand them as being pro-business. They do seem to understand energy independence, but occasionally you're suspicious that, maybe they like cheap gas prices a little too much, and they're dealing with a lot of fires, and so ours is just one of many. But how would you characterize, or how do you react to some of those thoughts?
Yeah, it's certainly a concern that we've heard a lot. We've been in touch with many folks in the administration since day one of this crisis, and we've been very impressed with their concern for our industry, as well as their sort of understanding of how this industry works, both across the administration, but also in Congress. We've, been providing data and information to them, and they've been asking us for information as well so that they can help make better decisions. I think a couple things to note, there certainly is an attractiveness to low gas prices, but the point that we've been making, which, I think, the vast majority of the administration in the Hill, has a very clear understanding on is in an environment where there is, total demand destruction, that there is no stimulus effect to low gas prices. And I think that's pretty well understood, but it is an important component of our message.
Do you pick up on, Ann, any, we have this Russia-Saudi soap opera. Do you pick up on any subtleties or anything interesting around our relations with those two countries, or what might be happening? Or maybe it's not the kind of thing you can share, but I think we're all kind of watching that and wonder about that twosome.
Absolutely. As a general matter, I think that there is a great deal of diplomacy going on behind the scenes, both at the State Department, And it was reported that the Department of Energy recently sent a full-time envoy over to Saudi to help address this situation. You know, Saudi is an ally, which, you know, I think they have been reminded of, both by the administration, but also by members of Congress. And, you know, that is a message that is continuing to be delivered. I think Russia is a little trickier because, you know, their relationship with the U.S. is a little trickier. But I know that those conversations are happening as well.
So you mentioned Congress. I guess we were getting close on the Senate package. There was a lot of news coming out of that. Anything you'd share about Congress and what they're doing and some of the last minute fighting, or just any observations on them?
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like by all accounts, they're very close to a deal. You know, once that is agreed on, you know, and nothing is agreed on until everything is agreed on. But, you know, they're working on language and final drafting, and we expect something to come together here in the next day or so. You know, assuming that it gets a big vote in the Senate, which is the hope, it's possible that the House could actually just clear it by unanimous consent, because while the Senate is here working, the House is back in districts, and there's a lot of concern about trying to bring members back to vote from a health perspective. So the goal here is to get enough consensus that it passes without actually having to take a reported vote, but that is still an open item. But the outlines that we're hearing is that it would be a $2 trillion stimulus package. There would be cash payments, there would be aid to industries, there would be aid to small businesses, there would be some tax provisions in there as well as some direct appropriations. I think the other thing that's notable here is that, you know, this is hardly the last word in what Congress will be doing, Congress or the administration will be doing to address this crisis. I would expect additional stimulus measures potentially focused on infrastructure in the next few weeks. And I would also expect the administration to look internally at what they can do without Congress's approval.
Awesome. George, we, in all this, the oilfield service space is obviously reeling from what's going on in the upstream space. What would you just tell us about that community, those companies, the investors in that space? Give us a snapshot of your world.
Yes, it's a really good question, and it's going to be fascinating to watch, because I think what we'll see is a new all-time low on U.S. active rig count and active horizontal spread count. So just to better frame that, where we sit today around 700 rigs, our base case is that you get to around 350 U.S. onshore rigs active by the end of the year. The prior low, if you went back to February of 2016, we troughed from an oil price basis at about 26 bucks. 2 months later, we were at 385 U.S. onshore rigs. You hadn't seen a rig count that low in over a decade at that point, and we probably get to around that 350-ish rig count mark, assuming this crude oil price holds and the strip holds. So people often forget that it's the oilfield services companies that kind of help the hydrocarbons actually get extracted from the ground. They're the ones doing the heavy lifting there. So the concern is, you know, if you cut too deep and start, instead of cutting off fingers and toes, cut into bone, our ability to respond as an industry may be impaired. And on the frac spread side, you know, we were 282 frac spreads last month. That fell 13% month over month in March. That's a very sharp reaction. The potential positive that comes out of that is those are the folks completing the wells, getting them ready to come onto production. And so we may have a supply response faster than we typically have if you're pulling off those frac spreads at a much faster pace than drilling activities going down, which is what we think you're actually seeing.
Is there any safe space if you're an investor in oilfield service?
You know, generally the names that we've been advocating that we think are the safest names, kind of our top picks, are Schlumberger, Dril-Quip, Cactus, and Apergy are kind of the top 4 core names, and I think you can keep your shopping list short while the volatility is still ongoing. You don't necessarily need to be a hero. Historically, when you look at the names that can actually generate the most attractive returns on capital and free cash flow in a downturn, the oilfield equipment manufacturers, the folks who make widgets, just by their very nature, can sell out of inventory and kind of live to fight another day. So that's one of our favorite subsectors, and those are some of our favorite names across the landscape.
So Matt Portillo, on the upstream side, I noticed your team started talking about dividends and the potential to cut dividends. And I'm also curious for reactions to what George said, which is, we do need to have a partnership between upstream and OFS if we're going to keep OFS healthy enough to help us recover eventually. Are you hearing anything interesting from your upstream clients and investors about that?
Yeah, Maynard, that's a great question. So from an upstream perspective, I think the first response has really been a deep cut to capital programs. And as we've updated our views going into 2020, we're now expecting U.S. onshore CapEx to fall around 50% this year. And so the industry has responded very quickly, which I think has been well received by investors across the board. However, I think the concern, broadly speaking, is that this could be a protracted downturn. And particularly in the front end of the curve, we could see a plunge in towards the teens from a crude price perspective. And in that world, really, it's about survival. And so investors have, I think, indicated to management teams that in this black swan event where you have a ramp in OPEC plus supply in conjunction with a collapse in demand, that the door is open at the moment for a suspension of dividends, particularly in the independent space. And really at the point in time when the commodity price starts to improve, companies could reinstate those dividends. So I think that's really the key focus right now is survival for the investors and really trying to discuss with management teams the best path forward. In a lot of cases, that could be around both capital cuts and potentially a suspension of dividends. On the services side, I think the industry is very aware that it is a partnership between service providers and the upstream space, and they are trying to work as much as possible to continue to have a healthy service industry. However, the magnitude of the cuts that are coming through are just a function of where the commodity price is. We don't sense there's a huge push for further price discounts, but at the end of the day, that might be just a reflection of where we are in the cycle. Generally speaking, we're hearing operators looking to reduce costs by 5 to 10% from here, but that may become really through in the system from drilling efficiency and completion efficiency gains more than it really will be on a pricing perspective.
So you mentioned the near-term pressures, Matt. Let me just ask Colin and Mike. I think one of the comments I've heard from you guys is that commodity traders or investors are even more negative than equity investors right now, and it has a lot to do with that perspective. But Colin, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think it's just the time perspective that each of the different groups is forced to live in. So the commodity people are obviously in the moment, day in and day out, on how many airplanes are flying and how many cars are driving. And of course, the investors are discounting cash flows over a longer period of time. And so what's happened just in the last day or so is we're seeing wholesale regular grade gasoline prices fall below 20 cents per gallon in Chicago and under 30 cents in New York and the mid-continent. Yesterday, the prompt NYMEX RBOB crack went negative. That price was plus $16.50 2 weeks ago. Now it's minus $2.85 per barrel. So that really forces the question of what are we going to see the refineries do? How much do they have to cut their runs in response to 22,000 flight cancellations globally per day, which is the latest number. And that number is probably going to be a cut of 4 to 5 million barrels per day on total refinery inputs, with the question being duration. How long do we have to have that happen? To put that in perspective, the combined effects of Katrina and Rita, the two hurricanes from September 2005, was 4.5 million barrels per day. And Harvey back in September of 2017 was about 3.7. So it's comparable to the most severe hurricanes we've seen in recent years. Percentage-wise, it's also comparable to what China went through just back in February. And they've actually had a pretty sharp recovery in just about 4 weeks. They've been able to get back 14 percentage points of utilization, and it looks like it'll take 8 weeks to sort of move through the process. That, too, is consistent with what we've seen in the past. So we're going to get a deep hit here to runs, but probably one that's measured more in the 2 to 3 month range as opposed to something longer than that.
Mike, would you pick up on Colin's comments about, it's basically just a massive traffic jam of too much product, and what's going on with, just oil storage and in particular?
Yeah, I think if you look at how this kind of unfolded, 2 months ago was a demand issue with people looking at China down 4 or 5 million barrels a day in demand. Then it turned into a supply issue with Saudi saying we're going to flood the market with 2 to 3 million barrels of crude. And now it's become a demand market again where you probably got another 8 to 10 million barrels globally off just because countries are just shutting down wholesale. So you got a market that is anywhere from 10 to 20 million barrels a day oversupplied. It has to go somewhere. It's going to go into storage, and there's a concern that storage over the next couple months is going to run out. We see some guys talking about storage, crude oil storage running out in the next 30 days. That's going to have severe implications for flat price and also basis differentials across all the basins in the U.S. And so that is coming home to roost really quickly with people, and that's get equity guys scared. And that's why a lot of commodity traders are playing those type of trades.
I mean, when you think about the probability that we don't fill storage, doesn't that seem really small to you?
Like Colin said, it's really a duration problem. If we're sitting here 30 days from now and demand is really kind of inflected back, then we're not going to worry, and it's probably been overhyped. Okay. But right now, people do not expect demand's going to come back that fast. And so, yeah, we're going to be breaching up against storage in Cushing and probably in other areas of the world.
And Maynard, one thing that we're seeing from clients is a question of, what's global storage capacity, and, can you quantify all of this? One point that Mike and I have been making to clients is that it doesn't need to be full storage globally. It could be a regional full storage story in a particular commodity. And that's why the Gulf Coast is very much in focus right now. And if you look at pricing of options, WTI versus Brent, Brent is much less worried about a single-digit oil price for crude than is WTI. But those probabilities are literally bouncing around, intraday, because obviously none of us know truly what the duration of the outage is going to be. But I just took a look at premiums here at the end of the day, and WTI is saying there's a 6% probability of a single-digit WTI price by April 21st.
So, Ann, maybe I could come back to you because Mike mentioned, the one way that we don't fill storage is basically we turn on the world again. And I'm just curious, Ann, if from your Washington dealings, if you pick up on this tension, the president was talking today about, or there was this reference that he'd like to get the world going by Easter. You see him being itchy to turn things on again. Do you have any color around that tension in Washington?
Just that it is, an ongoing discussion both in Washington and probably in every home across the country. Many of the shutdowns and shelter-in-place orders and that sort of thing are really being driven by governors and local officials. So they really have, ultimate say at a local level as to, who's staying home for how long. But yeah, I mean, that is absolutely an ongoing tension and an ongoing debate in terms of, how long is the federal government going to encourage folks to stay home and to what extent? I'm not sure we know exactly where that's going just yet.
One question for Doug McGovern. Doug spends all his time in energy restructuring. Doug, my impression is the restructuring conversations have gone from, they used to be upstream only or mostly upstream. They've now spread across the space. Do you want to just give a sense to the audience of how you're spending your time, what it feels like, what the attitudes are, how busy things are, anything you would add about the credit world and what you're seeing?
Yeah, thanks, Maynard. Well, there was a number of questions embedded in there. I would say, first of all, this has been an incredibly busy time for anybody in the capital structure and restructuring space. We've seen just, as this has been alluded to by a number of the other participants on the panel today, just a really historic dislocation in the credit markets. So, I mean, I would start with just the observation that all forms of liquidity to the upstream market have really dried up. So categorize that in three different thematics. The first is around the RBLs, or the RBL banks, who were really under significant pressure even back over the last 6 months and over the last couple of months in particular. Those pressures have come from commodity pricing continuing to be at levels that have impacted the ability of those banks to feel comfortable with their coverage levels. Have also impacted their ability to stay within conforming limits with some of the regulators. And then ultimately in a number of situations, including White Star, Alta Mesa, Approach, Grizzly, and a handful of other upstream operators, have ultimately resulted in impairments for first lien RBL banks, which has resulted in increased scrutiny across the board, and an imperative that they try to decrease their exposure. So those were my talking points 2 weeks ago. So that's dramatically worsened for the RBL banks. I saw a price deck that was used. That was an interim price deck for one of the major commodity lenders that came out late last week, that was showing WTI at $30 for the rest of this year, going to $32 for next year. And as your viewers will likely know, these price decks are used for the calculation of borrowing bases for upstream companies. Obviously, 5 or 6 days later, that price deck is significantly out of date, and so we're seeing that price decks are coming down even more. I'm expecting for borrowing bases across both oil and natural gas weighted upstream operators to come down between 25 and 35%. We've already heard that in certain cases, those borrowing bases have come down by as much as 50%. It's very case specific. It depends on the commodity weighting. It depends on the leverage. It depends on how drawn they are and how good the relationship is with the bank. But across the board, I think that there's going to be significant shrinking in liquidity from the RBL banks to the operators. So the next thematic for liquidity is what's going on in the high yield market. And Colin, I think, and others have noted this as well. The high yield market effectively has frozen up for upstream providers. Many well-known investment grade upstream operators have seen their bonds gap down 20, 30, 40, and 50 points. And our understanding, based on talking to a lot of the largest investors, is that the upstream high yield market effectively now just trades by appointment. So there's very little liquidity in that market, and a lot of fear about how to potentially monetize those positions and what would happen. What would happen to the extent that these companies have to go into a restructuring. And then the last thematic, which also is related to liquidity, is what's going on with the alternative capital providers. And we've gotten a lot of calls from the big alternative lenders, private equity funds, and hedge funds who have expressed a great deal of interest in deploying capital in this historic dislocation, but their interest is in either other parts of the energy vertical, whether it's midstream infrastructure operators or refiners. And for now, they are taking a pass altogether on upstream operators. So there's a severe liquidity shortage, both from the liquidity that's the lifeblood of these companies from the RBL banks, and liquidity in the market for all of the high yield bond investors. And then at this point, at least, there doesn't appear to be liquidity coming from alternative sources either. So let me pause there, Maynard, for any follow-up questions.
No, look, that was a great run through, and look, as I review all this, it seems like the theme of it, Ann's theme is the Washington is aware, which I thought was a great theme. The other themes of what I'm hearing is we have a near-term crisis to live through in terms of too much oil in certain places, too much refined product, oilfield service industry that is suffering severe strain. And in addition to the massive financial pressure on upstream, there's a massive curtailment of capital. But I don't know exactly how to wrap that up in a more optimistic way, except to say if we can get through this to the other side, it's got to be a heck of a lot better. We just somehow have to find a way to get through this. I'll pause on my summary. Anybody have anything else they'd add, thinking back on today's conversation, takeaways, things we missed?
I do just think, to your last point, one of the things that will be interesting to watch is, again, you've seen that accelerated decline in completions activity and I imagine production. So it'll be really interesting to watch the supply side evolve. Eventually we will get to a point where U.S. production actually starts to roll lower. I imagine we won't be unique in that situation, that there'll be some other international arenas where the pain is felt. So the good part of that is that eventually accelerates that recovery time frame, assuming we get a rebound in demand.
Well, and Kid Medlock was here last week, and he had a good point, which is, the rock is still the rock. The U.S. is still where you want to produce. So Ann's companies are still the heroes we always thought they were. And, U.S. production's not going away. Last call for any comments?
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that it's all about duration, right? Equity guys are sitting there going, you know what, I don't know if this is going to be this bad for the next 6, 9, 12 months. We were at over 100 million in demand for crude oil. You're probably down at 85 or somewhere thereabouts now. Is it going to snap back to 100 or is it going to be 95? And what are the implications of that? What does that look like from the curve? Then what is OPEC going to do? So there's a lot of questions that remain unanswered. And because of that, we saw a really big move in the equity markets today. That's almost scaring people more so. They'd like to see less volatility in stocks acting rationally. And so, we'll have to see how that plays out over the next 30, 45 days.
Well, I think we've all been cooped up as a nation and a world for too long now. And so I'm hoping we go to 110 when this is all over, because we're all so excited to get back in the game. I want to do a special thank you to Ann Bradbury for joining, and for everybody else, thanks for the time. And thank you to everybody out there. Stay strong.